Welcome to Beyond the European Accessibility Act, Why Digital Accessibility is a Continuous Journey, Not a One-Time Fix. I'm your host, John Avila, Chief Accessibility Officer at Level Access. Been with Level Access for about 26 years, and I'm one of the thought leaders at Level Access. So one of my roles is to track accessibility standards and regulations, and to work on the development of future digital guidelines for accessibility, as well as to focus on new and technology and how we can make sure that things are accessible from the start without having accessibility be an afterthought. Just a quick introduction to Level Access, if you're not familiar with us. We have been leading the industry for over 25 years with a holistic approach to accessibility end-to-end, both with our platform, supports our tooling and services, as well as a deep bench of people who are accessibility experts who support our customers. We have a number of different logos available. We support industries across B2C, B2B, government, public sector, etc. So moving along to our agenda, we'll be talking about the European Accessibility Act, some of the compliance requirements, and then moving beyond that, how to build accessibility into an organization's DNA. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers today as well. So what is the European Accessibility Act? The goal of the Act, which is a European mandate, is to make sure that people with disabilities, in particular consumers, can access a wide range of products and services. And the Act is aimed at primarily aimed at consumers. And the technology that is covered is a wide range of things that consumers would access, like commerce and finance and so forth. Beyond just people with disabilities, the point of the Act was to harmonize standards across Europe, to ensure there was consistency and fair trade, and to promote innovation of technology that was accessible in the Union. Even though it's aimed at consumers, there are certainly implications for B2B companies. So if you're a company that makes software, but you sell it to other businesses, and then that business turns around and uses the software with a consumer, then your business customers will also want that software to be accessible. So it may not be a direct compliance requirement. It effectively becomes an indirect requirement because your customers, your business customers, will demand that the software be accessible so they can use it. So the benefits go beyond just the consumer. The Act, when the compliance date has passed, it was this past June, so it's been for 4 months now. The requirements have been in effect, and so it is currently in force. And we're starting to find more countries providing additional details and guidance about enforcement, so that is a helpful motivator to understand where each country is. Because the EAA is a directive, what it means is that each country in the EU transposed the law into their own national law, so one or more national laws. And with that, each country has one or more monitoring and surveillance authorities in that country. And so because of that, it is a little bit tricky to track. So as an organization, we have a legal team within our company that tracks these standards and guidance around them, as well as enforcement. And so we are tracking these things to make sure that we provide up-to-date guidance for our customers on the Act, and so forth. In addition to the country-specific requirements, countries have their own enforcement policies around financial penalties, other things as well, such as reporting and any sanctions that may come from not being accessible. So those are, it's really important to understand those risks when making your websites, mobile apps, et cetera, accessible. I'll just finish up the slide by saying that there are some exceptions for smaller enterprises. So an enterprise with 10 or less people and that's 200 million euros turnover or less, they do have exceptions for most of the requirements. Moving along to the types of services and products that are covered by the Act. As I mentioned, e-commerce is one of the ones that will affect probably the most folks, but there are others, media streaming services as well, like audiovisual services, certainly shops and restaurants that have e-commerce experiences, that have point of sale devices that they use in their physical stores. Those point of sale devices would be covered, as well as kiosks where people can purchase services. So you may be asking, what is an e-commerce service? So an e-commerce is essentially something that's initiated by the consumer at a distance. And so in this case, the consumer is a person who's doing something not related to their occupation. So an individual could be for their person or self or their hobby or whatever, is initiating a consumer contract. And so that consumer contract is what falls under the e-commerce requirements. And it's the goal of concluding that consumer contract that's so important, because it's not just the purchase, an online purchase. It could be the intent to purchase something. So for example, some of the national laws give some really good, useful guidance on how they interpret this. And so Germany's law mentions that booking a salon appointment would be covered, even if you were to pay for the service in the salon, because the consumer contract, the booking and the intent is scheduled online. That counts as an e-commerce service. So that mechanism would need to be covered unless it was a micro enterprise or some other exception to the Act. So it's really important to be thinking about whether a consumer is paying for parking, or whether they are purchasing a ticket to ride a vessel or some other transportation, or just purchasing chocolates online. Many of those things are going to be covered by the European Accessibility Act. And what's really important about this act, because it's aimed at consumers, it doesn't matter where the business is located. So if the business is located outside of the EU, it doesn't matter, as long as the consumers are within the EU, the Act applies, and the companies doing business with those consumers have to meet the requirements. So it's just important to keep in mind that really this does impact global business wherever your business is located. Beyond the e-commerce, the Act covers different forms of transportation, whether it be air travel, land, or sea. Those would be covered. So certainly anything related to airlines and trains and ships and information such as real-time travel information or booking tickets, all of that is covered as well. Personal financial services related to consumers are covered under the banking provisions. So this would be anything from investment advice to consumer banking, e-payment, e-signature, many different types of things like that would be covered under the requirements. And the banking, of course, extends beyond just the things that we think about like mobile apps and websites to things like automatic teller machines and those types of things. And then lastly, another example of what's covered is computers and mobile devices that would be used by the consumers. And of course, mobile apps, but in this case, actual consumer-based devices. And so this is a combination of products and services. E-books and e-readers are also covered, but I think what's interesting about the computers and the hardware is that the requirements apply a little bit differently to manufacturers and importers and distributors. So because there's several different organizations in that ecosystem, even though the companies that import or distribute need to consider accessibility, even if they don't manufacture a product, because they're involved with the sale of those products in the EU, they're also covered, and they will want to make sure the products they're distributing and importing are accessible as well. I alluded to this earlier, but the types of technology that's covered with the products and services include things for like websites, mobile apps, digital content such as PDFs, Word documents, and Google Docs, and those types of things, ATMs and kiosks. So in particular, interactive screens that are not built into a vessel would be things that would be covered. So any interactive screens, point of sale devices. So if you're making a purchase in a shop, whether from a point of sale device, could someone use that device? Who uses a wheelchair? Could someone who's blind use that device to enter a PIN privately and securely? Those types of things. And then e-readers, ticketing services, any sort of support service as well. So if you offer e-commerce services, your support services are also required to be accessible. Or if you offer transportation or banking services, your support services would also need to be accessible, and they would be covered under the Act as well. I think it's probably a good opportunity to point out there has been some confusion around the deadline. As I mentioned, the deadline has already passed for compliance with the EAA. There is some provisions for 2030 for services that are delivered through products. And so some of you may be wondering, I've heard about the 2030 deadline. How is that different? So generally from an e-commerce, website, mobile app perspective, the deadline has passed. Things need to be accessible to people with disabilities now. However, in some cases related to kiosks and self-service services that are provided through the kiosks and things like that, there is an allowance for a longer timeline to be accessible because those physical devices have a longer cycle of being purchased and supported over time. So that you may have a longer period of time for some of those kiosks and self-service devices to be accessible. But when those new contracts are created and those new things are purchased, those devices need to be accessible. However, for websites, the timeline has passed. They need to be fully accessible now. So just to clear up any confusion on that point. Okay, let's move into the compliance requirements now that we've had an overview of the Act. The main goal is to create a set of functional requirements aimed at the core principles of accessibility, and so the Act, while it doesn't have specific technical standards that strictly have to be met, it does have what I would call functional requirements. The end goal and the whole point of the Act is to make things accessible to people with disabilities. And so it kind of, I would say, borrows the concept from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, which you may be familiar with. And these are the four principles really are perceivable. Can you perceive something with different senses? So whether you have a limited contrast vision or low vision or you're hard of hearing, can you perceive the content, whether it be on the screen or being spoken or presented auditorily? The second principle is operable. Can you operate the functionality with different needs, whether you have limited dexterity or whether you're using a keyboard or whether you're using a pointing device or a head pointer? Can you operate the functionality? The third principle is understandable. Can you understand the content? Is it consistent? Are the errors provided in a way that people can understand and correct errors and continue on? Can users navigate in a predictable way? Those types of things are covered under understandable. And then I would say plain language sort of also falls into there, that people can understand the language and be able to perceive the information, use the information. One additional item that falls under this understandability is the requirement for banking information to be at a certain grade level that is understandable by a common audience. So the plain language aspect is really important to make sure that your customers can know what they're entering into and know what they agree to in your services. And then lastly, the last principle is robust. And robust is really aimed at making sure that it actually works with the technology that people who have disabilities use. So if it's a screen reader used by someone who's blind on their Android or their iOS smartphone, does that technology actually work with your mobile app or your website in a practical sense? And so that's the robustness, is that it actually has to work for real people. From a practical standpoint, while you can meet the act and the transposition of the act into the most countries' laws by following these principles, it would be difficult for you to prove that. And so what we recommend is to follow the harmonized European standard, which is EN 301549. This harmonized standard has been published in the official European journal. So we recommend following that standard because it includes the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1, level A and AA, and additional criteria. Those additional criteria cover which are called clauses in the Act. Those clauses cover ICT, which is information and communication technology. So they go beyond the web, and they can be applied more to mobile software. They can be applied to kiosks and documents and so forth. So all those other areas are more covered, including video players. And so because the European standard that I'm mentioning here goes beyond WCAG, it is our recommendation that that be followed. And so basically it's WCAG 2.1 AAA plus some additional requirements for websites, mobile apps, et cetera. So if you're WCAG conformant, you're probably most of the way there, but there are some additional requirements that you should consider to make sure that you're fully meeting that standard so you can have the strongest case for compliance. I will mention that this standard is in the process of being updated. I would expect it early next year, and it will be updated to include WCAG 2.2 A and AA, and it will also be updated to clarify some of the areas that were less clear in previous versions. So it's they're always working on it to come out with a new version, and then once that version is published in the journal of the EU, then folks will be able to point to that new version. So I would recommend also when a new version does come out, aiming to meet that at least for new things that you're creating to make sure that you have the widest potential coverage. Beyond the functional requirements and the standards that I mentioned, there are some other considerations that you need to think about. These include monitoring. So this is what well the country's national authorities can monitor. This more in this case is about internal monitoring. And so this is internally as an organization, are you monitoring accessibility? Are you designing for accessibility from the start? Are you monitoring your production sites to make sure that accessibility issues did not get introduced? Are you keeping those records in a platform such as the Level Access platform? Are you training your team so that they have the skills not to introduce inaccessible content? And then do you have appropriate accessibility documentation on your website? So here we have it listed as an accessibility statement. We recommend that you have an accessibility statement that covers specific information about your services, the standards that you're meeting for the European Accessibility Act, information about authorities, but people can contact information for you, a place for feedback around accessibility. All those things are needed for the European Accessibility Act. While the Act itself doesn't say you specifically need an accessibility statement, it does say that you have to provide certain information to the public about the services, about the accessibility standards used, and so forth. And so while you could place that somewhere like in your terms of service, it would be best to place that in an accessibility statement. That's at the footer of your website through a link and available and easy to find for folks. So it's just an important thing to make sure that you do document that information in your accessibility statement. That's one thing that I think some people forget about after implementing accessibility. They don't think about their statement and how that can be supportive, but also can help you meet your requirements for compliance. This also ties into the broader organizational program around accessibility. So beyond the technical standards, the European Accessibility Act also has a concept of a design for all. So there's another standard, which is EN 17161, so 17161, that covers design for all. And this standard is really about the organization. And while the requirements are not mandated that you have to specifically follow that standard, the Act clearly requires certain things that align with that. And these are the things that we've talked about previously, which is designing in a way that is accessible to people with disabilities, making sure that accessibility is one of your core capabilities. So accessibility is as essential as security and privacy and those types of things, and very much for a person with a disability. If they can't purchase something or do something independently, then they don't have their privacy or security if someone has to assist them. So really, it very much is tied to that. It's also really important beyond compliance. So accessibility has return on investment for markets, not just B2C, but also B2B. If you're selling your software to companies that need to be conforming themselves, and it's about brand image and customer experience. Well, the standards are aimed at people with disabilities. The benefits, the side benefits, are for everybody. Everybody can use subtitles and captions to watch video, and other people can benefit from increased contrast or the ability to resize text. So they can have those same benefits depending where they are, whether they're using a mobile device outside or they're using something in a dark environment where they need dark mode. So there's a lot of benefits beyond people with disabilities. And I just mentioned, beyond that, really the design for all standard focuses on the program and the organization, you really want to be integrating accessibility and accessibility tools into all processes of the organization, whether it's ideation and planning to design and development to monitoring and maintenance of your software, and how you work with people with disabilities to get user feedback in inclusive design. All of those things are important to make sure you are successful. So with the finish line just with the deadline just passed several months ago, what are some things that we have found? So there's really 3 different sample organizations that we've seen. Some organizations have decided to take a very quick fix solution. It might be, let's deploy a widget which will solve some of the issues and address some of the issues, but it doesn't fully solve accessibility. So it gets you part of the way there. Or some organizations might just use automated testing and fix those issues. So, but they're not thinking about beyond the things that automated testing can't fix. That still leaves risk to the organization. So the folks who have done this, while they may have solved some of the low-hanging issues, they haven't fully addressed accessibility. And so they can still get fined. They're still not fully meeting their opportunities, because if people with disabilities can't purchase their products, then they're also losing out on that business. The second type of group of people that we have seen are the ones that have an incomplete partnership. So these organizations may have relied on an agency who said their site would be accessible, but perhaps didn't have the experience to make it fully accessible. And so these folks may have implemented part of the solution, but they really don't know if they're fully accessible. They don't know if there's compliance risk out there, because they trusted a partner who said they were accessible, but there was no validation by a third party to really make sure that was true, or perhaps they properly didn't vet that agency or party to really know if it really was accessible. I think most people have the intention of being accessible and say that they can build accessible websites, but at the end of the day, it's just been my experience that most folks don't fully create accessible websites, even if they intend to. And so that's why you really need to partner with a third-party accessibility expert solutions provider like Level Access to make sure that indeed things are usable by people with disabilities and comply with the Act. The third group of people is the wait and see approach. And I've seen this with some smaller organizations where they have maybe limited business exposure in the EU, and they're sort of taking this wait and see approach of, well, let's see if we get a fine or enforcement, or the authorities reach out to us, and then we'll just deal with it then. And there's certainly risk to that. And of course, each organization will have to look at their own risk, and they'll have to determine what level of risk they're willing to take or not take. However, there is risk to this approach, and certainly we have seen some threats of compliance in the past are under the EAA, for example, with the blind organizations in France going after grocery websites. So there's certainly the risk with not being accessible, and the threat is that potentially you could be limited to not doing business in a country or the EU if you don't meet the requirements of the Act. So it is something to consider, and why not address accessibility for the EAA, because it's a global issue. So if you have sites in North America, in the US or Canada or Australia or India as well, there's accessibility requirements in all of those countries. And so it's really important. This is not just an EU thing. Accessibility is a requirement across the globe, including the UK as well. So it's an important aspect of doing business today. Okay, wow, that was a lot of information. I know we've covered a lot, and so I just want to sort of recap with some next steps so you can think about what you need to be doing in the future. And so I would start with making sure you understand where you are with accessibility. So do you understand the areas where you're not in compliance today? So automated tools will only get you part of the way there. It's really important to test with assistive technology, with the keyboard, et cetera, with people that have disabilities. And those are some of the services we provide at Level Access, in addition to running the automated tools. Certainly evaluate your third-party tools. So if you're using any vendors or third-party plugins or resources on your websites, make sure that you understand the accessibility of those plugins or add-ons or integrations, and make sure your vendors are indeed providing things that are accessible, and validate that your vendors have done that. So to make sure that that's happening, because that tends to be a weak point where you assume that the thing you're getting is going to be accessible and it's not, or not fully accessible. Make sure that you think about from a internal capability perspective, that you have the training solutions, the tooling available, so your staff can design things from the start to be accessible. You'll be able to reduce the cost by about anywhere from 10 times to 30 times by designing things from the start to be accessible, then fixing them after the fact. Think about compliance not just as a B2C, but also a B2B, a good thing for business, as I mentioned previously. And then adopt this continuous mindset that accessibility is something that's an ongoing effort. And so instead of trying to sprint for a marathon, I don't want to say accessibility is a marathon, but it's a long-term thing. You want to do it in a sustainable way where you don't get burned out. You want to make progress, real progress, but I think you have to understand that you can't solve all the issues at once. And so you want to do it in a way that you are indeed working over time to address the issues, and not taking the approach of let's do everything now and then we'll move on to something else and forget it for a year, because then that just gets you back to where you were before. And then lastly, which is the future. We're working on a lot of AI solutions to help automate and speed up the process to really scale accessibility. And so we can provide more information as needed on those solutions, but definitely think about the future and how automation and AI can assist you in reaching those goals faster. And then lastly is the key takeaways. Certainly, if you haven't started, start now, and think long term, as I mentioned. And then finally engage with an expert. So if you're not working with a digital solutions provider on accessibility, you really, in order to make things accessible and not break them later, you really need the tooling, the platform, the expert assistance in order to ensure that happens and that you remain accessible. Okay, now let's go ahead and pause for any questions, and I'll be happy to go through those. It looks like we might have a few. So the first one is how do you see companies' websites that aren't e-commerce used to buy products, but in the future want to have third-party plugins that lead customers to, say, Amazon? Would those come under the intent to buy? So that's a good question, and I just preface by saying, I'm not an attorney. If there's any legal questions, you should consult legal counsel on that. But just from my perspective, I'm going to answer from my perspective. Like typically, just like a brand site or informational site, those things are typically not going to be covered. And if there's like a brand site that has a product and just has like a buy now button, and when you activate the buy now button, it takes you to Amazon or takes you to some other retailer, that's probably not covered. So the Amazon would be covered or the other site that sells it, but just having a buy now button probably wouldn't be enough to be seen as part of that concluding a consumer contract. But perhaps if there was more like maybe subscription services or rebates or some other aspect related to the consumer contract that was more in depth, then those other features could be. But just a buy now button on itself likely would not be something that would be covered. Okay, so we have do NGOs with limited budget public subsidies have to meet the requirement as well? So if you have e-commerce, then likely the service is covered. It's not who's providing the service, but what the service so if you have a covered service and you're not a micro enterprise, or there's not some other exception, then those organizations might have to meet the requirements. There are other public sector requirements in Europe and other countries as well. So there may already be some requirements that apply to certain organizations because they're part of public sector bodies. So like public transport is one example where they may already have to meet other accessibility requirements, like such as the Web Accessibility Directive, because they are a public sector body. Okay, looks like we have another one here. You spoke around working with agencies that say they provide accessible compliance. What would those agencies need to provide in order to prove that? Oh, that's a good question. So it's not just the end proof, but I would say there has to be documentation and proof before you start. And then there has to be proof points and gates as you're working with them. And then there has to be sort of the end goal. And certainly I would also say contractual language around accessibility would be good if possible to agree to. So what that would look like up front would be you defining what documentation you want, what the process would look like up front, looking at sites they've created in the past to make sure they're accessible. The ongoing documentation would be checkpoints to evaluate their templates, to evaluate the components they're designing before they're officially delivered or before they're implemented, to make sure those templates and components are accessible before they're turned into a full site. So it's evaluating that progress as it's happening. And then of course, validating at the end that everything that you've done so far is indeed there, that things didn't break or content didn't get added that is less accessible. So it's sort of along the whole journey, you have to be involved in making sure that it is accessible, or you have to work with a third party for them to validate. So sometimes we work with the agencies and partner with the agencies. So you could find an agency that is partnered with a company like Level Access to make sure that they are doing it in an accessible way. I can't say that some won't try to charge more for accessible sites. That's certainly things that we have seen. It really should be baked into the process, but there could be some additional for external validation to happen. There could be some additional cost to that. If you can do those things internally, if you can validate those things yourselves, if you have that experience, that could certainly help you there too. So just checking I think there's a question in chat as well. It said, I missed the beginning. We are a German software B2B company providing products and services worldwide, should we treat it urgently, similar to GDPR? Um, so that's a good question. So the EAA is in some ways is similar to GDPR around the data protection and privacy requirements. From a B2B perspective, it certainly depends on you may not have compliance requirements directly, but your customers may be. So going back to that question is, who do you sell your software to? If you sell your software to a company who then uses that with a consumer, then those business customers of yours will want your software to be accessible because they're using it with their consumers. They have to comply with the act. That's one aspect. Maybe your business customers use it with their employees. Well, then that wouldn't be covered because it's aimed at consumer facing software, not employee facing software. So you sell software, it's used by employees of a company only internally, may not be covered by the EAA. However, it could be covered by other requirements. So for example, many European countries have government procurement requirements and government public sector requirements around accessibility. As I mentioned, the Web Accessibility Directive and so forth. In Germany, there's also standards around that apply to federal government and other public sector bodies. So if you sell into the public sector, that may be a requirement. And there could also be other requirements for employee-facing sites. For example, Italy has a requirement called the Stanca Act that's been enforced before the EAA. France has a framework called the RGAA that's been in place before the EAA. And so it is certainly possible that employee-facing content might be covered in some other countries, and it may depend on your business customers, whether they have to meet those laws, may depend on their annual turnover. For example, 250 million annual turnover for the country-specific laws in France, or I believe it's 300 for the law in Italy. So it just may depend on some other factors. But those are good things to be thinking about. But in general, we are seeing accessibility more and more as a business requirement for businesses, and many businesses in Europe also have to meet ESG goals, so environmental, social, governance requirements, and some of those requirements will necessitate them documenting the accessibility efforts they've taken around including employee-facing things. So it may align well with those ESG or other efforts. So they may require accessibility. Another law that's on the horizon, if you sell, for example, into financial institutions or federally regulated businesses in Canada, the Accessible Canada Act will apply to federally regulated organizations, including employee-facing content. So there's certainly an opportunity there from a business perspective to make your B2B software accessible. Just to follow up, so we have a follow-up question. Our customers are hotel companies, and the users are the employees who use the tool, financial and so forth, not hotel guests. Yeah, so there may be some sectors where employee-facing content does not fully need to conform to the standards. Again, almost every country does have accessibility laws, and those laws generally do protect employees with disabilities, but those laws may not have specific standards that have to be met. And many times accommodations can be made or allowed without following a specific standard. So there are some cases where a business may not mandate that software, like hotel software, have to be fully accessible. So it just depends, and it depends on your business requirement. So you may not always see accessibility come through as a requirement today, but I would expect more and more in the future that you could get that as a requirement. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. Great questions, and like I said, we will follow up with information about the recording, and if you have any other questions, you can reach out to us My email is john.avila@levelaccess.com, and I'm also on LinkedIn as well. Thank you.